So I thank you all so much for taking the time to be here with us. I really, really appreciate your time and you taking the time out on a Thursday afternoon to join us. As people just continue to trickle in, I will just introduce myself. So my name is Savannah Dodd. I am an anthropologist and a documentary photographer, originally from St. Louis, and I'm now based in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And in 2017, I started my PhD in anthropology at Queen's University Belfast, studying the processes involved in archiving photographs of Troubles era Northern Ireland. And in the same semester, I founded the Photography Ethics Center with the aim of raising awareness about ethics across the photography industry. And with the center, I do a host of things. I create educational content through writing and podcasting. I develop online courses. I design and facilitate workshops. I organize events, and I lecture, all on the topic of photography ethics. And I was honored in 2018 to be contacted by Ron Iphofen to edit this volume on visual research methods as part of his series, Advances in Research Ethics and Integrity. So thank you for very much for that opportunity. It's been a very rewarding opportunity, and I'm very happy to finally be here at the launch of the book. So to give you an idea of the format for today's event, I definitely don't think it will go much more than an hour. I think I'm going to try to keep it right to an hour, try to keep it short and snappy. But we're going to start by having a bit of an introduction to the series by Dr. Ron Iphofen, who will give us an overview of the Advances in Research Ethics and Integrity series. After that, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the themes behind this volume. And then we're going to get, we're very fortunate to have several of the authors, contributing authors here with us this evening. And two of them will be giving us a little bit of a taster as to the kind of thing that you can find in the volume. So we'll be hearing from Dr. Lounasmaa and Dr. Jenny Carlston. And then finally, for the last maybe 15, 20 minutes, usually at events like this, we'd all be gathered in a beautiful room at the Queen's campus, and we'd have a glass of wine in hand, and we have an opportunity to sort of mill about. And unfortunately, due to obvious circumstances, that is not the case. So I thought it might be really nice if we could try to replicate that sort of feeling of getting to know who all's in the room by going into breakout rooms. So, we can get a chance to know other people who are in the room and share our research interests and what's brought us here in a more informal environment. So hopefully you all will enjoy that. I know I will, and it'll be an opportunity to grab a glass of wine or a cup of tea and chat. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so I won't drone on any longer at the start, but do stay with us to the end. Emerald have very generously shared with us a discount code for 30% off the book, exclusively for attendees here today. So I will share that with you after the talks and before the breakout rooms. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ron Iphofen. Dr. Ron Iphofen is the executive editor of the Emerald book series, Advances in Research, Ethics, and Integrity. And he edited volume 1 in the series, Finding Common Ground, Consensus in Research Ethics Across the Social Sciences in 2017. Since retiring as director of postgraduate studies in the School of Healthcare Sciences at Bangor University, his major activity has been as advisor to the European Commission and its agencies, the European Research Council and the Research Executive Agency. He was vice chair of the UK's Social Research Association. He updated their ethics guidelines, and he now convenes the SRA's Research Ethics Forum. He published Ethical Decision-Making in Social Research, a practical guide, and co-edited the SAGE Handbook of Qualitative Research Ethics. And he's currently leading a new 2.8 million euro EC-funded project that aims at promoting ethics and integrity in all non-medical research. So thank you very much for joining us today, Ron.
Thanks very much, Savannah. Thanks for the introduction. And I don't need to say any more about myself now. after you've done that. So I appreciate that. And I'll just take about 5 minutes to introduce the series before we get into your wonderful volume, which is a fantastic contribution to the series. Just to say a little bit about where the series came from, because I think this is quite important in terms of understanding international perspectives on ethics and integrity in research generally. And that is, myself and a few colleagues in the UK Academy of Social Sciences came together over several concerns about how research ethics was being dealt with and handled. And we didn't all have the same view, but one thing that we did feel was that there was an awful lot of different codes and guidelines around on research ethics, which was only confusing for researchers and for ethics reviewers alike. And so we held a series of symposia over a 3-year period. We found the funding for it and we were supported by the Academy of Social Sciences. And the idea was to try to get a consensus just across the social sciences about setting up, if you like, a set of guidelines that we could all helpfully follow and avoid this notion of there being a disparate sets of codes and guidelines everywhere and not, people not knowing which to choose. It's a particular problem for novice researchers, but it's even a problem for experienced professional researchers, perhaps researching in a new field. Well, needless to say, we didn't manage to achieve the aim of those symposia. We did not get a consensus, at least not a consensus for something that you could call a comprehensive set of guidelines. We got agreement around 5 basic principles, and those are published on the Academy of Social Sciences website. So it seemed to me that, therefore, what we needed to do was to establish if you like, a set of sources that we could regard as, establishing the field or setting the grounds for people to work on in the future. And this is a particular, if you like, a personal mission of mine, if you like, because the things that frustrated me was, the reinvention of wheels that keeps going on. When somebody's solved a particular research ethics problem in the past, we should not be ignoring it, but we should be able to find out what it is, and we should then be able to build on it. And as new research venues, sites, arenas arise, and as new methodologies arise, then, they set new research ethics challenges. So it seemed obvious to me that we need to establish a book series. I thought about a journal, but there is a problem about a journal in that, maybe 1 or 2 of the articles in every issue of the journal appeals to a particular set of people working in a particular professional field or disciplinary field. Whereas if you have a book series, then you can say, if you're interested in this field, then this is the book for you, because this establishes, a basis from which we need to build. So the idea is that all the books in the series are about advances, the advances that have been made, and where we need to go to take, if you like, each of those projects forward. So yours is the 5th in the series. The previous books have all, my first one was on the problem of achieving consensus. The second one was about virtue ethics as a particular, it's more of a sort of moral philosophical angle, but it's an approach I'm particularly in favor of, the notion that, it's the virtues of the individual researcher that really matter, no matter what the codes and guidelines are. If you've got a good researcher, a morally good researcher, then you should be fairly safe. You should be protecting people in ways in which you feel that they ought to be protected. And then we had one on media research. Now, the only other thing that I wanted to say at this stage is that there are several books in the line that I think people would be interested in looking at. We've got one on Indigenous research. We've got one on research with service users. And we have one on disability research. Actually, the one on disability research is by a good friend and colleague of mine who used to work for the National Disability Authority in Ireland. So those are online, and there are plenty more to come. And we've got lots of ideas. And I want to invite people to think about, if they've got an idea for a book in the series, to get in touch with me and let's consider it. I think the other thing to say is, as Savannah and the authors involved here will have appreciated, it takes a long time to get a book into production. A lot of effort, a lot of work. And actually, I think in this case, I think you did extremely well in getting it out in basically a 2-year period, just a little over 2 years. That is also helped by a good publisher, and I think we have an excellent publisher in Emerald. Very supportive, very helpful. The individual publishers are really good to work with. So, that's a recommendation to anybody who is thinking of publishing any other book. Do get in touch with Emerald. They're extremely supportive and extremely helpful. The final thing that I want to say is about this volume in particular. I was, when one's recruiting for an editor, you just don't know what you're dealing with. You have no idea who you're going to end up with, how good they're going to be, whether they're going to deliver the goods, and if they've got the skills to recruit the right authors in order to also help with delivering the goods. So, and this isn't just simple flattery, Savannah. You did an excellent job. I chose extremely well, and I knew that when we talked together in the early days. You chose extremely well in the authors that you've got. This is a very high quality book that I will be commending to as many people as I possibly can. And one important thing to say, my ongoing work is with the European Commission for several of the agencies, including the ERC. And we often come across really challenging research ethics issues. Increasingly, they're interdisciplinary. Increasingly, in fact, they include anthropology of various kinds and ethnography of various kinds. And very often, some of the more traditional reviewers don't know how to handle these things. So what I will be saying to them, whenever visual imagery comes up as a research ethics issue, I'll be saying, I know the book just for you. So let me say at this point, very well done. Thank you so much for the work that you did and all the work that the authors did. This is certainly a book to be proud of, and a book that I and others, I'm sure, will be recommending for some years to come. It hits the nail on the head in terms of advances. So thanks again, and thanks for the time, the opportunity to say these few words.
Thank you very much for that, Ron. That was all very, very kind. And I really appreciate it. I definitely will say I was very, very lucky to find the contributing authors that I did find, and it was a great group of people to work with. It was a huge privilege. So thank you very much for that. To show you the book as well, this is the book here. So so you have a sense of what you're looking for. And I thought I would maybe take a little bit of time to introduce the volume. And I don't want to spend too much time belaboring sort of fine or theoretical points, but I do think it could be useful to maybe set up a little bit of the rationale behind this particular volume in the series. But my introduction to the volume is available for free online, so you can also definitely check that out at your leisure. But this book, as has been stated, is about the ethics of using visual media in the generation, analysis, and presentation of research data. And of course, visual methods could include a huge array of artistic media. So it could include painting or drawing or sculpture. But this volume focuses particularly on photography and film. And that's really because of the unique relationship that these media have with the idea of truth and representation. So unlike drawings or paintings, photography and film are indexical, which means that they have a direct relationship with the real. And this idea of indexicality stems from the physical relationship between objects and their image, which is created through the process of film photography. So if you're not familiar with how a camera works, basically light bounces off of an object, bounces into the camera and onto a photosensitive surface. At its core, that's the process. And this is a physical interaction. So the image could not exist without the object having been there. Digital photography, of course, works very differently. Light still bounces off of the object and into the camera, but it's captured in a different way. Light is captured by an electronic chip, which records the photograph as a long string of numbers, which is then interpreted by computers. It's not a physical object in the same way a film photograph is. However, this special relationship to the real is not a feature that's present in film photography and absent from digital photography. They both are imbued with this idea of connection to reality. And sorry, I've lost my place. Although we know that digital photography is not as reliant on the thing having been there, and it can be more easily manipulated, digital photographs are still imbued with this special relationship. So in order to understand this, we need to first understand how photographs communicate meaning, and they do that through two ways. First, through what is literally pictured in an image, and second, through what icons are invoked. These icons are codes and conventions that come from visual culture, and we use them when we take a photograph. But there's one icon that's inescapable for photographs, and that's the icon of indexicality. The photographic object has become an icon that signifies a direct relationship to the real simply by being a photograph. So this all sounds very theoretical, and I apologize for the sort of theoretical interlude, but I do think it's important to talk about this because it has very real implications for ethics and integrity when using film and photography in research. Film and photographs, unlike painting and drawings, carry this icon of indexicality and are therefore considered representative of reality. So because of this, we have an added responsibility as researchers to ensure that the meanings communicated through our images are accurate and appropriate. I hope that makes sense and is helpful in understanding sort of the rationale behind focusing on these two specific mediums. Although indexicality is not the primary concern, you'll probably be grateful to hear after my explanation of many of the contributing authors in this volume. I do hope that it set it up well. But instead, the chapters in this volume focus on the ins and the outs of approaching, designing, and executing research using visual data with ethics and integrity. So the authors go beyond the idea of sort of a one-size-fits-all guidelines, and instead they offer advice for contextualized approaches for addressing the unique challenges presented by visual research methods. In the volume, you'll find three key areas of exploration: voice and agency, power and inequality, and context and representation. Within voice and agency, our Lounasmaa, Signum Essen, and Crispin Hughes reflect on the challenges they faced while facilitating visual storytelling workshops in the Calais Jungle Refugee Camp in 2016. Angela Stephanie Mazzetti outlines the limitations to protecting the identities of research participants when using photographic methods and explains the potential risk for participants when their identities are not protected. Siobhan Warrington traces the ethical decisions made during the course of research for Save the Children's The People in the Pictures report. She explains how she used photo elicitation methods in interviews and focus groups, highlighting the ethical risks of the method and the ways in which she worked to mitigate those risks. Within the section on power and inequality, we have Robert Godden, who engages in a dialogue with freelance photojournalist Smita Sharma to identify practical solutions for the successful implementation of informed consent in image gathering. Cahill McLaughlin and Siobhan Wills will use their experience, of producing a film about the violence inflicted by UN peacekeeping troops in Haiti as a case study for understanding ethics and integrity in research-based filmmaking. Jacqueline Shaw advocates for long-term as opposed to short-term or one-off projects when using participatory video as a more ethical mode of engagement, especially among marginalized communities. And within the final section on context and representation, Kira Chambers describes how filmmakers have recontextualized visual data by using archival material and how they've responded to ethical challenges that have arisen as a result of reuse. Susan Brigham and Mohammed Karbak draw on their experience facilitating a participatory photography project among youth with refugee experience in Canada, and they assert the need to situate ethics within sociocultural contexts of production and reception of the research images. Alice Neeson explains that the objectives of action-focused research often lay in the processes of visual data production rather than in the analysis of the resulting visual data. And she highlights the potential ethical implications of disseminating visual data without including analysis. And Jenny Carlston describes the challenges, of image-based research within institutional contexts whose frameworks are often not relevant for or applicable to work with visual data. So, as you can see from that very quick overview of 10 chapters, we have a very wide range of chapters and a very wide range of expertise that comes up in this volume. And it engages with work that's been conducted in many different countries using very many different methods and addressing many different ethical questions. So I really hope that, as Ron said, I really hope that this book will be an important resource for students and researchers from all sectors as they navigate these difficult challenges or difficult questions in their own research projects going forward. So today we're really lucky to have many of the contributing authors present, and to have two of the authors who will be presenting summaries or a little bit about their chapters. So first of all, I would like to invite Dr. Aura Lounasmaa, who is a lecturer in social sciences at the University of East London. She worked as part of the award-winning team from the UEL in the Calais jungle to teach a university course in the camp in 2015 to 2016. She currently directs the Erasmus Plus funded pre-sessional university course Open Learning Initiative for refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. So Aura, do you want to pop off mute?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you for the introduction to the volume as well, both of you. I have to, and I really want to thank Savannah, because it's such a difficult task to take on, to edit a volume like this, and she's been eminently patient and supportive all through the process. So thank you for that. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. So the chapter has been co-written with two of my colleagues, one of whom is Chidam Essin, who's one of the co-directors of the Centre for Narrative Research at University of East London. And her expertise in working with multimodal narratives was really a guiding, she provided a guiding framework for how we thought about storytelling in the context of visual methods as well. And the other person we worked with, both in the Calais jungle and then in this chapter as well, is Crispin Hughes, who's a photographer, and his work includes a lot of community participatory photography. So he's worked with young people, school children, communities affected by floods in India, communities affected by HIV in South Africa, and more. So his experience of working in visual method, using photography in particular, and participatory photography at that in marginalized communities was very important when we worked in the Calais jungle. So the project we did, we started off by teaching a university course, which was an accredited course, 5 UK credits, which is 2.5 ECTS. So very tiny program that we ran in the Calais jungle. We had 37 students who completed the program and got their certificates. But in the course of the year, where we were traveling over from London to Calais on twice a month, every second week or so, we came into contact with over 100 people who were coming on to some of the sessions, participating in our discussions, and taking part in some parts of the project. As part of the course, students could submit their coursework in different ways. Some of them were writing really long narratives. Others were writing shorter pieces of narrative, but we were obviously working with people who, some of whom had difficulty expressing themselves in English, none of whom had any access to technology. There was very little access even to writing materials. So most people were just working with their mobile phones if they were able to charge them and have access to the internet as well. And people would have to leave their possessions behind at a very short notice. So anything like writing materials wouldn't have been something that they would be able to carry with them. And one of the ways, and we thought as well, in how we could, so there's a lot of there's a lot of benefits for working with photography, and some of which Savannah has already mentioned in regards to representation, issues like that, but also the language issue for a lot of our students meant that photography could be a medium where they could express themselves more easily. So Crispin Hughes and another photographer, Gideon Mendel, worked in the camp with 21 students over several weeks, and we provided digital cameras, and we talk about the reasons for providing digital cameras in the chapter as well. The many other projects so contextually as well. I mean, I have to say, when Savannah was talking about the 3 sections in the book, we have agency, we have power, and we have context, and it would be impossible to separate all those 3 issues in the chapter and then in talking about the project that we did, because all of it comes together. So in the context of an unrecognized refugee camp where everyone's lives were disposable already, disposable cameras were just not an option that we wanted to present. So we had good quality digital cameras that the students worked with, and we asked students to take photos, some of them as part of their coursework, others were using this project for their own ideas of what they wanted to express. And we had loads of barriers that we had to then deal with in terms of what could be shown. So for people who wanted to continue their journeys to the UK, we had to be careful that there was no evidence that we were providing that these people had already been in France, because in that case, their asylum case might be turned down by the UK Home Office. There was also the violence that was experienced by people who were living in the jungle. There was the transitional life. So some people were in the camp for several months, some were only there for some days or weeks. So keeping in touch with people, with our participants, and continuing to reaffirm the consent for how the photography was used was a very difficult task. There is a lot of this, so we discussed all of these issues in the chapter, and there isn't really any solutions that we can give. And what we come to as well is that the way we imagined ethics while we were in the camp was something that we could discuss. We could have those discussions, and it was situated in that particular time of living in the camp as well. But now, several years later, it becomes another question again, even with the participants with whom we're still in contact. How we use the photos now brings another question of how we allow participants to move on to new lives which are not connected to the jungle, and not bringing them back to identifying as refugees over and over again. So no solutions, but a lot of questions. A lot of the work that was done by our participants is in this book. It's called The Voices from the Jungle, and it's just been translated into French as well. And here you can see some of the photographs. For the reasons of consent and the ongoing consent and all of that, we didn't put any of those photos in the chapter, but here we have the original consent, so the photos can be found here. And the stories as well that went with the photos. Yeah, and I mean, just in the question of representation, obviously we also have the relationship to reality, as Savannah was saying, but then we have the relationship to the media representation, which in the case of the Calais jungle was a very important factor in trying to balance what kind of images we show, where do we show them, and what stories do they tell to the audiences who see this, and contrast this to what they already think they know about the jungle. So yeah, those were just some of the things that we discussed in the chapter, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think that was a great sort of rapid fire overview of your chapter. And in particular, I really appreciate that point that you brought up just now and that you wrote about in the chapter about how, even the ethics of how, how you're writing this chapter and what goes into this very book, you incorporated that into your, your description of or your reflection in the chapter as well, which I thought was really useful to think about that, of course, because this is again another context, right? So thank you very much for that. I'd now like to invite Dr. Jenny Carlston to speak, and I'll give her a little bit of bio. So Jenny Carlston has published on Irish cinema, documentary, cinematic emotion, and film and history. Her research explores the role of emotion in film viewing, looking at formal strategies and audience response within the context of emotion theories. She's the co-editor of Film, History, and Memory. Dr. Carlsten is the lecturer in the School of Communication and Media at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, and she also works for Film Hub NI, where she is researching the UK's community cinemas. And if you can unmute yourself, then I can find you.
Yeah. Thank you, Savannah.
I'll make you a host so that I know you've got a couple slides.
I do. So I'm going to use a few, it's more like illustrations to the talk rather than proper slides, really just to give you guys a break from looking at my face and seeing that I'm reading off a bit of paper. So thank you, Savannah, and thanks so much for organizing this event under such difficult circumstances. It's really great to see so many people here, and I'm so happy that I got to be a part of the volume. You managed the process so well, and I think it's going to be a really useful resource. We're living through really, I would say, really awful times, and these questions of ethics and integrity can sometimes be quite depressing, actually, at the moment. And when I started thinking about what I might contribute to a volume like this, I realized that what I really believed was that all the problems facing us as researchers aren't separate from, but really are tied up with these larger questions about how we move through the world. And that really what we need is a holistic approach to visual research ethics. So in my chapter, which is a bit different, I think, from some of the other chapters, and it's not rooted in my work. I'm not a practitioner, but more of a theorist and a historian of film. So in my chapter, I suggest really that we need to change our thinking about our own work as scholars and redirect our research practices away from individualism and utilitarianism and towards a more collective, reflective, and empathic mode of working that runs through scholarship from bottom to top. I'm just going to share my screen here for a moment. Okay. And hopefully you're all seeing that. So in my chapter, then, I begin by restating a problem that's already been noted here tonight, and that's the lack of practical, appropriate, or applicable frameworks. And we don't need, as Ron noted, a set of commandments to rigidly dictate the parameters of visual research. We might also find that legalistic institutional frameworks, which are really designed to protect the institution, aren't adequate, or the guidelines which they compel us to comply are not fit for purpose, leaving us with a bureaucratic burden but not a corresponding clarity of purpose. So many image-based researchers have spoken already of the need for more creative or flexible approaches to research ethics. And in my chapter and elsewhere in the volume, we discuss some of those creative or flexible approaches. A few key ideas emerge from these alternatives: listening to our subjects, for instance, acting in collaboration, or even breaking the rules in the service of the collective good. Clearly, there's a need for a more robust approach to image-based research for practitioners and for those who use others' images in their work. And Savannah's own work on ethics in photography suggests 3 guiding principles for that: empathy, autonomy, and integrity, principles which Savannah argues can guide individual choices more effectively than checklists or institutional guidelines. So if we're to move towards, or if our aim is to move towards a more collective, engaged, and reflective mode of research, there must be changes not only at the level of institutions and frameworks in which we operate, but at our own lower level actions. And as we think differently about the world and our place in it, our research practices should also change. I argue in my chapter that we need to challenge the institutional approach to research ethics, which is driven by a utilitarian philosophy, And I refer in part to Johann Neem and his ideas about the state of higher education as a sort of instructive parallel. So Neem is critical of both utilitarian approaches, which produce the best outcomes for neoliberal clients, and pragmatic ones, which define our success through outcomes, specifically for universities, our contribution to employment and economic measures, rather than any inherent values about knowledge and learning. And I think that screen scholarship especially finds itself pulled between these competing models, as universities seek to monetize screen scholarship through a greater focus on an appeal to industry, and as practice-based research expands to draw in more researchers from outside the traditional humanities base, these tensions increase. Researchers increasingly have been trained in and acclimatized to work cultures which emphasize utilitarian or pragmatic values rather than Aristotelian ones. The neoliberal normalization of casualized labor and the freelance gig economy, meanwhile, forces individuals into increasingly difficult circumstances and isolates researchers from each other, effectively silencing dialogue, undermining individual agency, and removing the physical and discursive space for debate or dissent around ethical concerns. This indicates a third philosophical position, one that Ron's mentioned already, that of virtue ethics. And virtue ethics are character-based rather than derived from the consequence of actions or from authoritarian restrictions and duties like the Ethics Review Committee. And under a virtue ethics framework, then the means and the ends are inseparable. So I suppose maybe this kind of sets up the researcher as a kind of heroic figure, maybe a bit of one in a sort of Arthurian mode, that we're preserving good by being good and virtuous individuals. So I guess the question there is, do we need to be sort of Galahad to be an ethical researcher? Or does that kind of high standard just set us up like Sir Lancelot for, a terrible fall? And it strikes me that those values that Savannah brings to the front of empathy, autonomy, and integrity are characteristics not of research, but of researchers. And so they are perhaps that set of ethics values to which Neem is referring. And by acting as autonomous, empathetic people of integrity, will we then necessarily produce research which is itself ethical? So as researchers then, how do we operate as autonomous, empathic, and integrity-seeking individuals? So I tried a little bit in the chapter to come up with some propositions to help us to do that. Firstly, that we need to recognize that image making is a collaborative process that has these many, many stakeholders in it, between photographer, filmmaker, subject, crew, activists, audience members, and we're all human beings, and with our own needs and responsibilities to consider in an evaluation of the work. And when we consider that images are constructed and interpreted through these divergent perspectives, we open ourselves up to a more empathetic and complex understanding. Secondly, that we need to broaden our notion of sources, of what makes a source. And contemporary image-based research is predicated on a shift away from written archives. We see a shift in the hierarchical ranking of archival material, with amateur filmmaking, found photographs, home movies, these kind of things rising in status. As image-based researchers, we have an ethical responsibility to consider how the hierarchy of the archive informs or limits our work. Likewise, when we reject the notion of a straightforward indexicality and accept that the image bears a more complicated relationship to the real, we inevitably reject a valorization of objectivity. Instead of judging images based on their accuracy, we might think of their intent and their contract with the viewer. And that means that as screen or image scholars, we have not just a pedagogical, but an ethical obligation to consider the formal construction of the images we study. And we can't be fooled by claims to indexicality or by the false transparency of realism. So maintaining our commitment to formal analysis is then an ethical act. At the same time that we broaden our understanding of sources and stories, ethical scholarship requires that we consider the emotions that our research accesses, exploits, or engenders. Rather than striving to adopt a detached position or demanding that of our subjects, we might consider being more transparent and reflexive in our own practices and our outputs. So rather than seeing emotion as an obstacle to overcome, we see it as an inherent and valuable resource. As part of a more reflective practice, image-based scholars must consider the context in which images are produced. Increasingly, that means being attentive not just to national context, but regional, transnational, and micro contexts. And here, especially learning from and listening to other stakeholders is essential to an ethical approach. Along with this, an ethical approach might call for more attention to reception and audience and the discourse around images and the paratexts that extend beyond the image. How do we as researchers respond to or participate in these appropriations? I would say as academics, at least, most of us hope to be a part of that discourse. And so that gives us an additional burden of responsibility for how our contribution is used. When we think about, finally, our relationships with others, we shouldn't limit this to the subjects of our research. Our relationships with colleagues, peers, and professional collaborators are important to our development as ethical scholars. So just as the tick boxes of ethics committees are no substitute for a culture of ethical reflection, HR policies and workplace standards are no substitute for collegial ethics, simply the radical idea of being nice to each other in the workplace, being actively supportive in our language and behavior, forgiving the mistakes of our coworkers, and showing courage in our relationships. Our individual actions as researchers impact the integrity of our collaborations with others. Transparency around decision-making recognizes people's autonomy and enables informed consent. Acting with empathy means not pulling up the drawbridge behind us, but actively working to improve conditions for those at earlier stages of their career, supporting those in precarious, casualized labor. Requires generosity, giving time and lending voice to support one another, listening to others, especially those whose lived experience doesn't resemble our own, to create space for reflection and self-inquiry. Just in closing, I'd say we certainly need space in which to argue our case for other approaches, space which is increasingly difficult to find. Lockdown and work from home orders, since writing this, ironically, have made this even more apparent. Without staff rooms, conference drinks, and water coolers, we're more separated as workers and as producers of ideas than ever before. So finding virtual and spaces that are free from institutional interference, where we can work collectively to establish shared principles, is essential. And I think that Ron's Advance in Research Ethics series is such a space, and this volume, I hope, is another room added onto that space. Emotional and moral engagement with our own research isn't something to be avoided, but something to be examined. It's only through the ongoing process of personal reflection and dialogue with others that we can realize best practice in our own work. So rather than a holy grail in this form of a set of guidelines and regulations, we would do better to pursue the ideal of a round table. And by developing non-hierarchical spaces for the exchange of ideas and best practices, we can encourage greater rigor and ethical scrutiny. By bringing people together to share their experiences and perspectives and to listen to the voices of other researchers, we can create opportunities for empathy. And by promoting an institutional culture that values the autonomous ethical researcher, we can lay the groundwork for a holistic, values-driven approach to image-based research. So thank you very much. I need to stop sharing here. And yeah, and finally, just to say thank you to both Ron and Savannah for making this happen.
Absolutely, that was great. Thank you so much for that, Jenny. And I don't know if you all noticed, but actually ours chapter is the first one in the volume, and Jenny's is the last one in the volume. So I feel like they gave us, having both of them here tonight, I think gave us a really helpful overview of what's inside. Now, I would really like to invite you all to grab a glass of wine or a bottle of wine, as it were, and or a cup of tea or whatever floats your boat. And please do join us in the breakout rooms. It would be really great for us to have this chance to mill around and get to know who else is here. And we'll reconvene about 10 minutes and just have some concluding remarks. So finally, I just want to thank you all again very much for taking the time out of your afternoon to attend this event today. And thank you very much to all the speakers, to Ron, to Ara, and to Jenny. It really means a lot to me to be able to share and to celebrate this achievement with all of you during the pandemic in this virtual space. Sometimes it feels like we need a little something more to celebrate during these times. So I really appreciate you all attending and being part of this. I hope you enjoyed the talks, and I hope that you did have an opportunity to make some connections in the breakout rooms. So thank you so much for attending. And again, you can find the book at the link that I posted. I know if you're based at Queens, we already have the digital edition. Thank you, Ron, for modeling it there. That's great. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to go quiet now, but feel free to leave or to stay or to converse. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well done, Savannah. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to everybody else. It was very interesting and a useful way of launching your book. It's a shame we can't actually hold hands. We can't share the glass, clink the glass together, but I'll go and join my wife now for a glass of wine. Thank you so much.